Welcome to this explainer. Have you ever stood at a crossroads, just totally unsure of what the right thing to do actually is? And I'm not talking about picking a restaurant for dinner, right? I mean the big stuff. The ultimate human question of how we actually know what is truly ethical. Well, today we're exploring this really fascinating framework of laws, rules, regulations, and conscience. We're going to examine how society builds its guardrails and what happens when we're forced to rely on that quiet little voice inside our own heads. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting navigating ethical dilemmas, law as a yardstick, comparing laws and rules, the limits of legislation, conscience, and finally, the civil servant's dilemma. Section 1. Navigating ethical dilemmas. Finding the baseline for right and wrong. So, the fundamental problem we face is finding a reliable baseline for ethical decision-making in the real, messy world. Now, you might think the answers are obvious, right? But actually, none of the things on this list can be our sole source of ethics. Take religion, for instance. Historically, there's massive dissonance. You have the peaceful teachings of Buddha on one hand and the violent actions of the Taliban on the other. What about the law? Well, Section 377 was the law in India for over 200 years before society finally recognized it as unjust. Social norms, practices like dowry or jallikattu show us that just because something is considered normal, that definitely doesn't mean it's ethical. Science, technically speaking, science is completely neutral on moral issues like abortion. It literally just gives us the biological facts. And feelings? Well, human beings can sometimes feel perfectly good even after doing something objectively wrong, so none of these can be our only compass. Moving on to Section 2, Law as a Yardstick. We'll look at Thomas Aquinas and the hierarchy of laws. If those earlier concepts aren't the ultimate sources, where do we actually turn? Well, the philosopher Thomas Aquinas came up with this really fascinating hierarchy of laws. He starts at the very top with eternal law. Now, these aren't made by humans, they just exist eternally. Think of them like the unshakable physical, chemical, and biological rules by which the entire universe is ordered. Planetary motions, the flow of energy, the conservation of mass. These are the absolute, undeniable frameworks of reality. Stepping down the hierarchy a bit, we find divine and natural law. Divine laws are the ones revealed to humans through sacred texts. But natural law? That's where it gets incredibly interesting for us. It's essentially the eternal law, but perceived by human reason. It's our rational mind translating these massive universal truths into fundamental human necessities. Think about the basic need for food, or the universal demand for human dignity for everyone. That's natural law in action. And finally, at the bottom of this hierarchy, we arrive at human law. This is the formal codification of expected conduct. It's enacted by a governing authority, and, as you know, deviating from it attracts penal action. Think of modern examples cited in our sources, like the NRC, the CAA, or the farm laws. What's absolutely crucial to understand here is that as governance becomes more democratic, these codified human laws ideally march closer and closer to true ethics. So the crucial point is, why does society rely so heavily on human law as an ethical yardstick? Well, because laws are generally based on shared social norms. They strive for objectivity rather than some subjective whim. They're enacted by our elected representatives, deliberated by learned individuals, and deeply scrutinized by the judiciary. Plus, let's be real here, the fear of punishment is a highly effective external guardrail for keeping human behavior in check, right? All right, Section 3, Comparing Laws and Rules, looking at the external framework. Now, we often use the words laws and rules interchangeably in daily life, but there's actually a vital difference between the grand scale of laws and the administrative mechanics of rules. If you look at the ground level, laws are made by constitutionally recognized bodies, like legislatures, and they provide a very broad framework. Break a law, and the punishment is incredibly harsh. We're talking complete dismissal from a job or even prison time. Rules, on the other hand, are made by public or private executive bodies to provide concrete directives within the purview of that broader law. Violate a rule, and the punishment is generally milder, like a temporary suspension. Because rules exist for the smooth, day-to-day functioning of large administrations, they absolutely must actively reflect the public good at large. They cannot be aimed at harming the interests of others, and they certainly can't be designed for the selfish gains of a specific, isolated group. Basically, to be ethical,
Rules must be firmly rooted in collective opinion.
Which brings us to Section 4, the limits of legislation, the breaking point. So, we've seen the ideal structure of laws and rules, but what happens when the external compass breaks? The law is absolutely not infallible. It can be highly coercive. It can be collusive behind closed doors. And, quite dangerously, it can simply become a tool of the powerful to maintain their grip on society. Let's look at some historical and theoretical breaking points noted in our sources, times where laws were drafted for the selfish gain of specific individuals or communities. We see examples ranging from the lifelong presidency secured by Xi Jinping through legal mechanisms to the systemic, horrific oppression of apartheid. We see it in the collusive nature of electoral bonds, or even in unjust ancient texts like the Manusmriti in ancient India. All of these examples highlight a stark reality. Just because something is perfectly legal doesn't automatically make it ethical. Furthermore, even well-intentioned laws have massive blind spots. They can contain severe loopholes, extreme ambiguities, deep-seated societal prejudices, or they can completely neglect the rights of the individual in favor of the community. And this brilliantly illustrates how external guardrails frequently fail. This friction plays out in the real world constantly. We see new abortion laws in various states denying individual rights. We see completely undefined parameters of what actually constitutes corruption in anti-corruption laws. There are alleged prejudices within citizenship acts like the CAA, or massive conflicts between individual morality and current surrogacy laws. The external systems often come up short, creating a massive void that desperately requires an internal compass. Section 5, Conscience, the inner voice. When the external world fails us and laws are unjust, where do we actually go? Well, we turn inward, to our conscience. Now, look at this definition carefully, because it might actually surprise you. Conscience is not just a fleeting emotional whim or some random gut feeling. It is a highly rational decision taking place at the subconscious level. It's literally like a supercomputer transcending mere animal instincts. It operates after millions of calculations, permutations, and combinations of your life experiences, your character, and your morals. So how exactly does this subconscious computer guide us? Well, it's our most immediate source of information. When laws have loopholes, our conscience actually causes an inner dissonance, a literal psychological discomfort, when it's violated. And this discomfort is what actually drives us to avoid unethical actions, even when literally no one is watching. It's an immutable, lifelong companion that helps us interpret ambiguous laws and seamlessly integrate societal norms with our own deep moral considerations. But how do you ensure you're actually tuning into it and not just acting impulsively? Here is a highly practical, step-by-step method from our sources. Number 1, don't decide in haste. Give that subconscious computer time to process. Number 2, decide and then carefully review that decision. Number 3, write down the decision to make it tangible and real. And number 4, have a reliable conversation partner to bounce your thoughts off of. Finally, Section 6, the civil servant's dilemma, synthesizing logic and the inner voice. Let's bring all this theory back to the real world, specifically looking at the ultimate testing ground, civil servants and administrators. These folks have to navigate both the external rules of the state and their own internal compass every single day. Now, you might be thinking, well, if the law is flawed, just follow your conscience. But I have to warn you, relying solely on the internal compass is incredibly dangerous in administration. Why? Because conscience is highly subjective. It lacks formal legal protection. Frankly, it might not be fully developed in everyone. And crucially, it can directly conflict with established, democratically enacted bylaws. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that true ethical administration actually requires a marriage of both worlds. Decisions absolutely must be based on rationality and logic, rather than personal beliefs alone. You cannot just abandon the external framework because your internal voice disagrees. You have to synthesize the two to find the truly ethical path. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly memorable anecdote from our sources. Imagine a civil servant follows the rules to the absolute letter and builds a toilet in a rural village. But, lacking rational common sense, they don't provide a water supply to it. The rule was followed perfectly, but is it ethical? Is it rational? I'll leave you to ponder how you balance blind rule following with the logical, rational voice of your own conscience. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the compass you use to navigate the world.